Welcome. Well done for coming through the rain today. I'm not sure it's sunny in Bournemouth today either. I think it's raining back there as well. But all week we've been doing these talks looking at answers, or looking for rather, answers to some of these big questions in life. And it's our conviction, although we don't have exhaustive answers to all the questions we might like to know the answers to, there are sufficient answers to the questions we really need to know the answers to. And as we come to today's topic, that's really important to remember. We may not have exhaustive answers, but the question is, do we have sufficient answers that really make sense of life and reality and the Christian faith? And today we come to perhaps the biggest and possibly the most difficult question of all, the question of suffering. Because actually, you only need to look at the TV news on any given day to see that we live in a world that's absolutely filled with suffering. Whether it's the ongoing violence in Syria and Iraq, or Nigeria, or the news of those 21 Christians in Libya that were beheaded last week, we see suffering on an unimaginably horrific scale happening every single day. And in fact, our problem when it comes to suffering is not so much that we overestimate the problem, but if anything, we underestimate it. We can't even begin to imagine the kind of suffering that's going on in our world today. And sometimes we can be somewhat sheltered from it in the West. Now, I'm aware, in a talk like this, some of you might have come in, and suffering's not something you're thinking about at the moment. In fact, your life, apart from the rain, is particularly good today. And can I say, if that is the case, well, that's great. We're not wishing suffering upon anyone, and it's great that you're not going through this personally. But I'm also really aware there'll be other people here today for whom this is a really personal issue. And when you think about suffering, you're not just thinking about it from a philosophical point of view, but a deeply personal way. And if you're here and you're not asking it from a personal point of view, the reality, the sad reality is that at some point in our life, this will become a personal question for all of us. And so actually, I don't just want to look at this from a philosophical point of view alone, but really see if there's emotional answers, not just intellectual answers to this question. But it is a huge issue. It was brought up recently by Stephen Fry. It's probably not escaped your notice. It's been on Facebook and social media that Stephen Fry recently was interviewed by RTE. And in that interview, he was asked what he would say to God if he were to discover when he died that there was a God, and that God was to say, "Why should I let you into heaven?" And this is some of what he said in response. "How dare you? How dare you create a world in which there is such misery that's not our fault? It's not right. It's utterly, utterly evil. Why should I respect a capricious, mean-minded, stupid God who creates a world that's so full of injustice and pain?" That's what I'd say. And then he goes on to say this. So atheism is not just about not believing there's a God, but on the assumption there is one, what kind of God is he? That's a good question. In fact, such a good question. I wrote a book called What Kind of God? That's a little plug for that. But it's a serious question because it's not just, is there a God, but what kind of God? Is he a capricious, mean-minded God? And so in the face of suffering, along with Stephen Fry, there are many who say, well, there cannot be and there is no God. But can I say, if there is no God, it doesn't necessarily get rid of the problem, but it creates a different problem, we might say. And that is, if there is no God, why do we talk about the problem of suffering? Listen to what Richard Dawkins says in one of his earlier books. He said, "The universe we observe has precisely the properties we'd expect if there is at the bottom no design, no purpose, no evil, and no good. Nothing but blind, pitiless indifference." See, this is just the way the world is. That's what Richard Dawkins is saying. If we're just the product of evolutionary Darwinism, if that's all we are, then why ask the question, why? Why do we feel there is something wrong with suffering and pain and death? It's just another part of life, isn't it? This is what Friedrich Nietzsche said. "There is no reason to whatever happens, no love in the things that happen to you, no place of ease is open to your hearts." This is just the cold reality of the world we live in. Don't ask the question, why? And yet I would suggest lots of us do ask that deep question. And we do sense that there is something wrong with suffering. Actually, I don't think that getting rid of God gets rid of the problem. But of course, if we are to believe there is a God behind this world, it raises all sorts of questions. And just as Stephen Fry said, what kind of God lies behind this suffering world? And so really 3 questions I want to focus on before we have time for yours. Firstly, why is there evil and suffering in our world? Secondly, what has God done about it, if anything? And thirdly, what will God do about it? So firstly, why is there evil and suffering in the world? Before I went to study theology in Edinburgh, I took a gap year in Leicester, where I grew up, and I didn't go and chunder in the rainforests of South America like some people do. I stayed in Leicester, and I worked at this shop, W.H. Smith. Not quite so exotic, but there I was in the shop selling things like Bic Biros and computer games and CDs and whatnot. And after Christmas, I was working there, and I was put on the customer service desk, which, if you've ever worked in retail, you'll know is the worst place in a shop to work, isn't it? Because that's where everyone wants to come and get a refund. And I always had this long queue of, particularly after Christmas, angry parents bringing back faulty toys and games, wanting a refund. And my manager said to me, you need to decide on each occasion, what is the problem? Is it a manufacturing fault that's to blame, or is it the misuse of the owner that has led to this thing going wrong? And that's a really good question to ask, isn't it? Actually about our world. Is it a manufacturing fault that's to blame, or is it the misuse of the owner, the people in it? And actually the answer the Bible gives is the latter. See, the Bible's storyline starts with a God who creates a world that's good, a world without suffering, pain, death, or disease and sickness. And into that good world, God creates people to enjoy the world, to enjoy each other, and to enjoy Him. And then He gives these good people a choice. He says, you can live in that world your way, or you can live in it my way. Now, we might think, well, why would God give people that kind of choice? I mean, why would God allow people the very option to be able to do things their own way? But actually, love and choice go together, don't they? Well, one, you need to have the other. It's a bit like, imagine if I, during my time here in Bristol, meet a drop-dead gorgeous girl that I asked out on a date, and she says, believe it or not, yes. And so we start dating, and after a few weeks, maybe a few months, I finally get round to deciding to pop the question. And so I come back to Bristol, we go on a lovely moonlit walk down by the River Avon, and I get down on one knee, and I say to her, you will marry me. Now, it's only changing the order of the words to the normal formulation, isn't it? So it's okay, I think. And then I say to her, and when you marry me, I want you to know that you will cook me curry on Mondays, steak on Tuesdays, lasagna on Wednesdays, you will do the washing on Thursdays, the ironing on Fridays, and if you do it well, you can have a day off on Saturday. With such an attitude towards relationships, you can understand, can't you, why I am still single at the age of 33? Because that's not how relationships work, are they? Not that, of course, in relationships people don't do things for each other, but you do them not simply out of obligation, but out of choice. Choice and love go together. And in creating a world where real love was possible, God created a world where real choice was possible. And in fact, the tragedy of human history, the Bible tells us, is that people often take that choice to actually hurt others and to reject God. Actually, all of us can do it. You see, when we think about the problems of our world, we can always point the finger at people out there. George Bush once talked about the axis of evil. But actually, when Jesus spoke about, he didn't use the term the axis of evil, but the origin of evil, he said, it's not just certain countries in a different part of the world, but the problem of evil is much closer to home. He said, evil stems from the human hearts. Not just some human hearts, but every human hearts. That actually there's something wrong intrinsic with humanity. None of us are the people we should be. Coldplay, in one of their early songs, put it this way, a song called Clocks. Am I part of the cure, or am I part of the disease? See, we like to think we can be part of the solution to the world's problems, and hopefully we are seeking to try and alleviate suffering. But I guess if we're going to be honest, we have to admit that sometimes we can cause some of it, don't we? My words, my actions, my inaction can lead to and exacerbate the problems and the pain that other people feel. And so the problem of suffering is not just out there. Jesus says the problem that causes suffering is also it's also in here. Now, of course, you might be saying, well, what about the suffering that isn't directly caused by people? Not all suffering is directly related to the actions of individuals. What about a tsunami or an earthquake, a natural disaster or cancer, or the Ebola crisis in West Africa? You can't trace that to the actions of individuals and say, well, it's just because they did this. And I'm not sure we should. But the Bible does say this, that one of the effects of humanity's rejection of God in the first place has been that the world we live in is broken. It's not the world it once was. A bit like a virus that gets into a computer and affects the whole way your computer works. So the Bible says sin, like a virus, has infiltrated this creation so that nothing works the way it quite should. Everything's broken because of it. This world is not what it should be. Now, you might be saying, well, this isn't particularly nice news for a Thursday lunchtime. And I'm thinking, well, what did you expect on a talk of suffering? But can I just say this? If the Bible's storyline is true, if what I've just said is actually true, though this might not be pretty news, can I say, at least it makes sense of my experience of life. You see, when I look at this world, I sense there is something wrong with this world. When I stood a couple of years ago by the side of my friend's grave, something in me felt it shouldn't be this way. And the Christian story says there is something wrong with this world and it shouldn't be this way. Your emotions in that situation are absolutely right. This is not just the way things should be. This is not the way things should be. At least it makes sense of our emotions as we face suffering. That's the first thing. Why is there suffering? But here's the second thing. What has God done about it? I don't know what concept you have of God. It's interesting, as Stephen Fry says, that it's not just that people say, well, I don't believe in God, but our concept of God might be, like he says, a capricious, mean-minded, stupid God, a distant God, an uncaring God. What does God know about suffering? How does he experience it? And yet here's the incredible claim of the Christian faith. The claim is that God does know something about suffering because he also experienced it. Right at the heart of the Christian story is the claim that God himself stepped into space and time in human history. And if you think about the experiences that he went through, you'll see that actually he was quite familiar with suffering. He was born into poverty. He spent the first 2 years of his life as a refugee. He then lived in a country that was occupied by a cruel foreign power. He was misunderstood by his family. He was rejected by his own people. He was deserted by his friends. He was betrayed by one of his followers. He faced injustice, torture, and then death by one of the most painful forms of execution ever invented, Roman crucifixion. You see, the claim of the Bible is that it wasn't just another person, but it was God who was experiencing that. God experiencing suffering from the inside, as it were. And can I say, as I see and sometimes experience suffering and see it in those that I love, this really does help me because I see that the God that I follow has experienced it too. I was in Auschwitz a couple of years ago. It was a horrific experience to go around and be reminded of so graphically the things that happened there just over 70 years ago. And as I went round and asked the question, why and how could this happen? I was really struck by an engraving on one of the walls of the cells. Simply this. It's quite crude, but you can see what it's meant to be. The figure of a man crucified. And as I looked around that place and I thought of the horrific suffering and I thought about God, I thought, how can I believe in a God in the face of horrific suffering like this? Well, what if that God had also experienced horrific suffering and the horrors of this world? Edward Shillito was a Christian and a poet. He lived at the time of the First World War. He fought in the war, and unlike many of his friends, he actually survived. And after the war, he was trying to come to terms with the suffering that he had experienced and how he as a Christian could go on believing in God. And he wrote a very short poem that simply goes like this: the other gods were strong, but you were weak. They rode, but you stumbled to your throne. But to our wounds, only God's wounds can speak. And not a God has wounds, but you alone. How can you believe in a God in the face of suffering? What if that God has wounds and scars, who's felt it from the inside? Now, of course, you might be saying, well, what good does that do for me? It's very nice, you might think, to know that God can sympathize with us, but when we suffer, we want more than sympathy, don't we? Let me give you the illustration. Imagine if I were to meet you tomorrow walking down Woodlands Road, and I was to say to you, how are you feeling? And you say to me, well, to be honest, Michael, I'm not feeling very well. I've got this terrible headache, and I'm just not feeling great. And I say to you, well, to be honest, I don't have a headache. I am feeling particularly bright today. But I say, if you just wait for a moment, so then I walk over to the nearest brick wall and I headbutt it as hard as possible. And then I come back and I say, but now I have got a headache too. You have a headache and I have a headache and I can sympathize with you. Now, what would you be thinking about me at that moment in time? You'd probably be thinking, what an absolute fruitcake. Like, what is he doing? He's not helped himself, he's not helped me, and now we both need to go to Boots and get some paracetamol. I mean, we want more than sympathy, don't we? We want someone to do something about it. Which is why it's so important that the Christian message is not simply that God came into this world to identify with a suffering world, but to do something about it. That through the cross and through the death of Jesus, he was taking upon himself the ultimate suffering and the ultimate consequences of the brokenness of this world and the brokenness of my life, so that we may not have to face those ultimate consequences, and that even here, right now, I can be restored into relationship with the God who made me. He was actually making it possible, ultimately, for there to be hope of a world without suffering. And that I, even though I don't deserve it because of the way I've treated others and treated God, can be part of that world too. Now, it doesn't mean that we have all the answers. I really want to make that clear. There are lots of questions in relation to suffering that I don't have the answers to. Why did my uncle die of cancer? Why did a friend of mine get raped on the way home from a party? Why did one of my best friend's sons take his own life? I don't have the answers to those questions. I'm not sure I ever will have the answers to those questions. But what I do have is this: not the answers to those questions, but the confidence that I know what the answer isn't. Let me explain. If there is a God who loved me and you enough to come into this broken world out of choice, to suffer in my place so that I might have hope, if there is a God who was willing to do that for me, then whatever the questions I have about suffering, the answer cannot be, he doesn't love me. I look at the cross of Jesus and see that he does. And what I do know about God helps me with all the things that I don't yet know, and those unanswered questions that I still have. Here's a third thing, though. What will God do about suffering? I don't know what you think the future holds for our world. There's a song that I often listen to by John Mayer called "Waiting on the World to Change." Do you know the song? And it's kind of an interesting song because he says we're all waiting for the world to change. But actually, do we think it's really going to change? We figure basically the world will just carry on the way it always has. But actually, the incredible claim of the Bible is that one day the world will change. The storyline of the Bible tells us that the world today is not the way it once was, but the world today is not the way it one day will be. We're given a snapshot of the end of the story, and we're told that because Jesus not only died but rose again physically from the dead, there is a real hope physically for this world, for these physical bodies, for this creation. It's something we're going to unpack in much more detail tonight when we think about the subject of the resurrection and the future. But can I just say this? That gives me great hope because I see that actually this is not the way it always will be. There is hope. And not simply the hope that God will one day kind of rewind the clock and take things back to the way they once were, but one day they will be even better. I don't know whether you have read the books, Lord of the Rings. If you haven't, you've probably watched the films. And in the films, which I love, My favourite moment in all three films comes actually in the second film, which is quite dark and seems quite bleak. But there's this moment in the second film when everything seems bleak and dark and when it seems that death and darkness are going to have the final say, when Sam turns to Frodo, and there's this amazing speech that Sam gives. And Sam says to Frodo this. He says, "It's like in the old stories, Mr. Frodo, the ones that really mattered. Full of darkness and death they were, and sometimes you didn't want to know the end. How could the end be happy? How could the world go back to the way it was after so much bad had happened? But in the end, it's only a passing thing, this shadow. Even darkness will pass, and the sun will shine again. And when it does, it will shine out all the brighter. Those are the stories that stay with you, Mr. Frodo, even though you are too young to understand why." Oh, it's beautiful. You can tell it's beautiful because I memorized it. But it's beautiful because something of Tolkien's faith comes through in it. He doesn't just say, the sun will shine again. Well, we hope that in Bristol, don't we? And sometimes you start to doubt it. But he says, not only will the sun shine again, but it will shine out the clearer. There is a hope that one day not only things will be put right, but they will be even better than they were before. One of the verses in the New Testament says this: there is a glory, there is a future glory, a future hope that will outweigh all of the suffering, and that actually our suffering will in some way achieve. It's an incredible hope for those that know and trust Jesus. And so I guess the last question would be this: if God can bring about such a kind of new world without suffering and pain, why doesn't he do it now? Why do we go on living in this world of injustice and pain? And the answer I think the Bible gives is not that God doesn't care, but actually that he does about us. One writer in the New Testament, a guy called Peter, put it this way. He said, God is not slow in keeping his promise, but he's patient with us, not wanting anyone to perish, but everyone to come to repentance. That word repentance simply means to turn around. In other words, he's saying, before God makes a new world, he wants to make new people. Before God puts the world right, he wants to put our hearts right. There needs to be a transformation in me before there's a transformation in the world. And that transformation can come as I come to discover the forgiveness and the power of God through Jesus Christ. So my question as we close would be, have you ever experienced that? And if not, why not? I guess some of you might say, well, I've not experienced that, and I will never experience that because I think this whole thing is a load of rubbish. Maybe that's what you're thinking of what you've heard this morning or this lunchtime. Well, thank you for coming. But can I just throw this challenge out? If you're going to reject the Christian worldview, which other worldview are you going to put in its place? How else will you make sense of the suffering of our world when it comes to the reality of suffering yourself? We all have to have some worldview to live by. What will yours be? Maybe you're saying, well, I wouldn't really know enough to be able to kind of make that decision. And that might be fair enough. Maybe you really need to find out more. And there's going to be this course called Christianity Explored starting next Monday. And that will be a really great place to ask those further questions. But maybe actually there are some of us, and it's not so much that we need to know more, but actually we know enough to get started. Because actually it's not about passing an exam anyway. Thank goodness. We have enough of those already. It's about coming to know the forgiveness of Jesus and the hope that he brings to anyone who's willing to receive it.